This is a fictional story inspired by real life. Hope Miller was 28 years old, and she possessed the kind of quiet, resilient strength that only a life of hardship can forge. Her mother, Martha, had been a washerwoman and a seamstress in a small town outside of Boise, Idaho, teaching Hope from a very young age how to sustain a life with nothing but the strength of her own two hands. Martha's hands were always calloused and smelled of lye and lavender, a constant reminder of the labor required to keep a roof over their heads. She taught Hope how to cook nourishing meals from the meagerest of ingredients, how to sew a seam so perfectly that the repair was invisible to the eye, and most importantly, the discipline of saving. A woman who cannot save a penny from every dime is a woman who will forever be at the mercy of those who feed her, Martha used to say while folding laundry in the dim light of their rented cottage. She believed that dependence was the most expensive thing in the world because its price was paid with one's own dignity and soul. Hope's father had passed away when she was only 11 years old, following a tragic fall from a spooked horse during a summer storm, leaving Martha alone to raise 4 children in a world that offered little charity. Hope, being the eldest, stepped into the role of a secondary provider almost immediately, taking in laundry from the wealthier families in town at the age of 12. By the time she was 16, she had her own rusted tin box hidden beneath her small cot, where she dutifully placed 10% of every dollar she earned. She watched her brothers grow and eventually move away to the bigger cities, seeking fortunes that rarely materialized, but Hope stayed by her mother's side until the very end. When Martha lay dying at the age of 52, her voice a mere whisper of its former self, she gripped Hope's hand and gave her one final piece of advice that would serve as a compass for the years to come. She told her that when the moment came to truly begin her own life, she should never wait for anyone's permission. For permission is a gift one must grant oneself. Hope kept that sentence locked away in her heart like a precious heirloom, more valuable than any silver or gold her mother could have left behind. After Martha passed, Hope found herself alone in the small rented house, continuing the cycle of washing and sewing, always adding to the tin box. The years drifted by with the slow, predictable rhythm of a small rural town where everyone knew your business but few understood your heart. It was when she was 26 that Lawrence entered her life. A charming drifter who worked as a long-haul trucker, passing through the valley with a quick smile and the kind of honeyed words that are the favorite tools of men who never intend to stay. He courted her for 6 months with a calculated patience, appearing at her doorstep with wild flowers and promises of a stable future that Hope, in her loneliness, desperately wanted to believe. They were married in the small-town chapel with only 2 of her brothers as witnesses, and for 3 years they lived in that same rented cottage. However, the reality of marriage to Lawrence was far from the dream he had painted during their courtship. He was gone for weeks at a time, and when he was home he was a ghost in his own house, leaving Hope to sustain the household with the same hands that had been working since she was a child. She continued to save, but she moved her tin box from beneath the bed to a hidden compartment inside a roll of vintage fabric at the bottom of an old cedar chest. She knew Lawrence had a habit of searching the house for extra cash when his gambling debts grew too heavy, and she refused to let him touch the money that represented a decade of her labor. When Hope discovered she was pregnant at 28, she felt a profound sense of ownership and joy. For the first time, something was truly hers, growing within her own body, a life that no one could take away. She told Lawrence on a quiet Tuesday evening, but his reaction was a cold silence that felt like a physical blow. He claimed the timing was wrong and that they were already stretched too thin, but Hope knew that look in his eyes, it was the look of a man who had already decided to run. 2 weeks later, on a gray Monday morning, Hope woke up to a house that felt unnervingly empty. She reached across the bed, but the sheets on Lawrence's side were cold and smooth. When she checked the closet, his clothes were gone, and the small dresser was stripped of his belongings. The backpack he kept by the door had vanished, along with the few $100s she had kept in the kitchen drawer for emergencies. Lawrence had left before the first light of dawn, without a single note, without a word of goodbye, leaving behind nothing but the hollow silence of a room where the empty hangers rattled softly in the morning breeze. Hope did not cry that morning. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, with both hands resting on her 6-month pregnant belly, and took 3 deep, steadying breaths. She walked to the cedar chest, retrieved the roll of fabric, and poured the contents of her tin box onto the kitchen table to count her life savings. 12 years of saving 10 cents from every dollar had accumulated into a sum that was far less than a fortune, but far more than Lawrence could have ever imagined she possessed. The reality of her situation hit her swiftly when the landlord, a man named Mr. Henderson, knocked on her door that Thursday to inquire about the 2 months of overdue rent Lawrence had hidden from her. Mr. Henderson. Henderson was not a cruel man, but he was a businessman who had his own taxes to pay and a family to support in the city. He looked at Hope's pregnant form with a mixture of pity and discomfort, informing her that she had until the end of the month to vacate the premises. Hope didn't argue or plead for more time, for she remembered her mother's teaching that some battles are lost the moment they begin, and it is better to preserve one's energy for the next move. It was while she was buying a few basic supplies at the general store that she overheard a conversation that would change the trajectory of her life forever. 2 local farmers were discussing an old property on the outskirts of a nearby ghost town called Willow Creek, a ranch that was being sold for a pittance because it had fallen into near ruin and no one in the owner's family wanted the burden of its taxes. The property had gained a reputation for being cursed, or at least unlucky, as the previous owner had lived there in total isolation and died alone 5 years prior. Hope listened intently as the men described the property as a wasteland of overgrown weeds and crumbling timber located an hour and a half away from the nearest paved road. The next day, she took the bus into the city of Boise to visit the county clerk's office and inquire about the deed. The clerk, a dry woman who had seen countless desperate people looking for cheap land, showed her the papers for a place officially listed as the Reed homestead. The price was so incredibly low that Hope had to ask the woman to repeat it 3 times, unable to believe that her 12 years of savings would actually be enough to buy it outright, with a small amount left over for seeds and basic repairs. The clerk explained that the heir, a distant nephew who lived in California, was desperate to wash his hands of the property after 5 failed years of trying to find a buyer. Hope decided she had to see the land before signing away every penny she owned. She took a bus as far as it would go, and then walked for 3 long hours down a dusty, sun-baked dirt road, her pregnant belly feeling heavier with every kilometer. When she finally rounded the final bend and saw the ranch, she stopped in her tracks. The house was a small 2-room structure made of weathered wood and stone, the white paint having long since peeled away to reveal the gray timber beneath. The porch had partially collapsed, and the roof had 2 visible holes where the shingles had been ripped away by a mountain storm. The fence around the yard was a jumble of broken wire and rotting posts, and the weeds had grown so tall they reached her waist. It was a ruin, a skeleton of a home. But as Hope stepped through the gate that hung by a single rusted hinge, she felt a strange, inexplicable sense of belonging. The walls were still standing straight. The foundation looked solid, and she could see a stone well in the backyard that looked like it had been built to last a century. She pushed open the front door, which groaned in protest, as if it hadn't felt the touch of a human hand in years. The air inside was thick with the smell of stagnant time, dust, and old pine needles. There was a small living area with a dirt-caked floor, a wooden table shoved against the wall, and 2 chairs that had been knocked over. In the kitchen there was a heavy cast-iron stove that appeared to be in good condition despite the rust, and a stone sink covered in years of grime. Through the back door, she could see the remains of what had once been a magnificent garden, the rows still faintly visible beneath the carpet of wild grass. Deep in the back of the property, she spotted a large, gnarled apple tree and a patch of wild herbs that had somehow survived the neglect. It was an impossible task for a single woman, let alone one who was 6 months pregnant, but it was the only open door in a world that had suddenly closed all others to her. Hope returned to the city the next day, her mind made up. At the clerk's office, she counted out her coins and wrinkled bills onto the counter, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. The clerk counted the money, stamped the deed, and handed Hope the official document with her name, Hope Miller, typed neatly on the line for the owner. Hope folded the paper carefully, tucked it into the inner pocket of her dress, and left the office with her single suitcase containing everything she owned. She walked the 3 hours back to the ranch, this time not as a visitor, but as the mistress of the house. She arrived as the sun was turning the Idaho sky into a canvas of deep orange and purple, the light hitting the weathered wood of her new home. She sat on one of the upright chairs in the kitchen, exhausted and alone, listening to the profound silence of the valley that now belonged to her and her unborn child. That night, she slept on the floor of the kitchen, using her clothes as a mattress, feeling the baby kick with a restless energy that seemed to mirror her own heart. The first few days were a blur of back-breaking labor. Hope woke before the sun, sweeping out years of debris with a makeshift broom she had crafted from bundles of willow branches. She hauled the first bucket of water from the well, relieved to find it clear and icy cold, a sign that the underground spring was still healthy. She scrubbed the stone sink until it gleamed, repaired the front gate with some discarded wire, and managed to get the cast-iron stove working on her second attempt. She ate her simple meals of bread and cheese sitting on the back doorstep, looking out at the yard and visualizing the garden she would plant. It was on her 8th day at the ranch that she noticed a specific floorboard in the kitchen that made a hollow, echoing sound every time she stepped on it. The board was located near the stove, and it seemed slightly more polished than the others, as if it had been handled more frequently. That afternoon, with the June sun streaming through the glassless window, Hope knelt on the floor, placing both hands on her belly to steady herself as she wedged her fingers into the narrow gap between the boards. The wood gave way with a soft creak, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the floor. Resting in the shadows was a rusted tin box, roughly the size of a large cracker container, sealed shut with a length of twisted wire. Hope lifted it out, her heart hammering against her ribs, and brought it to the table. She untwisted the wire with fingers that were raw from cleaning and pried open the lid. Inside, she found a collection of silver dollars, their surfaces dulled by time but their value unmistakable. She counted them slowly, one by one, her breath catching in her throat as she realized she was holding 43 silver coins, some dating back to the early 1900s. It wasn't $1 million fortune, but it was more money than she had saved in her entire life. Alongside the coins, there was a yellowed envelope folded into fourths. Hope opened it with trembling hands, revealing a letter written in faded blue ink with the tight, elegant penmanship of a man from a different era. It was signed at the bottom by Cornelius Reed. The letter stated that he had lived on that ranch for 47 years, having bought it as a young man with the money he earned as a wilderness guide. He wrote that he had aged there alone, never having married or fathered children, and that he knew his time on earth was drawing to a close. He didn't want his savings to fall into the hands of a nephew who had never visited him or cared for the land. He had hidden the coins for the next inhabitant, whoever they might be, under one simple condition: that they care for the earth, for the soil was good and had provided him with a lifetime of happiness. He asked that the new owner learn to love the silence of the valley and not let the ranch fall back into the hands of the wild. In a hurried postscript, Cornelius mentioned that in the back room, inside a locked cedar chest, he had left his tools and a collection of journals that might be useful to someone starting over. He noted that the key to the chest was taped to the bottom of the tin box she was currently holding. Hope reached down and found the small iron key right where he said it would be. She walked to the back room, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, and unlocked the chest. Inside, she found a set of high-quality gardening tools, a sturdy hammer, a saw, and a stack of leather-bound notebooks. She sat on the floor and opened the first journal, finding it filled with meticulously recorded data from decades of farming. Cornelius had documented every frost, every rainstorm, which crops thrived in which soil, and how to treat various pests using only natural remedies found in the surrounding hills. As Hope read the words of a man she had never met, she felt a profound sense of relief. She wasn't starting from zero. She had been given a map by a man who had walked this path before her. The journals contained 47 years of wisdom, from the best time to plant winter squash to the exact ratio of salt and lime needed to whitewash the exterior walls. Hope wept then, not out of sadness, but out of the overwhelming realization that she was no longer alone in her struggle. She spent the rest of the evening reading the journals by the light of a single candle, feeling the weight of the legacy she had just inherited. She decided right then that she would honor Cornelius's wish. She would make this land thrive again, not just for herself, but for the baby who was now moving with a vigorous strength inside her. She fell asleep that night with a notebook resting on her chest, dreaming of rows of green corn and the smell of fresh whitewash. The following morning, Hope began the real work of restoration. She used some of the silver coins to travel to the nearest town and buy the supplies she needed: shingles for the roof, a large bag of lime, new hinges for the doors, and enough seeds to fill the garden. She worked with a slow, deliberate pace, mindful of her pregnancy, but driven by a newfound purpose. She repaired the roof one shingle at a time, standing on a sturdy ladder she found in the barn. She mixed the whitewash and painted the exterior of the house until it shone like a beacon against the green hills. The garden was her greatest challenge, but she followed Cornelius's journals to the letter, clearing the weeds and preparing the soil with the hand tools he had left behind. By the end of the second week, the first rows of beans and squash were in the ground, and the ranch was beginning to look like a home once more. It was on a particularly warm afternoon in late July that Hope met Clara. She was in the backyard, struggling to pull a particularly stubborn root from the garden beds, when she heard the sound of firm footsteps on the gravel path. She stood up, wiping the sweat from her brow, and saw an elderly woman standing at the gate. The woman appeared to be in her late 70s, with snow-white hair tied in a neat bun and eyes the color of amber that seemed to see right through everything they landed on. She wore a sturdy denim dress and carried a walking stick made of dark mahogany, though she stood as straight as a young pine tree. She introduced herself as Clara, a neighbor who lived 2 kilometers away over the ridge at Pine Ridge Farm. Clara explained that she hadn't seen smoke rising from the reed chimney in 5 years, and when she saw it a few weeks ago, she decided it was time to come and investigate. Clara entered the yard with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. She sat on the porch bench that Hope had recently repaired and accepted a glass of cold well water. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being the wind whistling through the apple tree, before Clara began to ask questions. She wanted to know who Hope was, where she came from, and why she was out here alone in her condition. Hope gave her the honest, abbreviated version of her story: the death of her mother, the betrayal of her husband, and the purchase of the ranch with her life savings. She didn't mention the tin box or the silver coins, feeling that some secrets were meant to be kept until the time was right. Clara listened with a quiet intensity, nodding slowly as Hope spoke, her amber eyes never leaving Hope's face. When Hope finished, Clara revealed that she had known Cornelius Reed for nearly 40 years. She had been the one to find him when he passed, having noticed the lack of smoke from his chimney, just as she had noticed Hope's arrival. She described Cornelius as a stubborn, kind-hearted man who loved the land more than anything else in the world. She told Hope that Cornelius had once mentioned he was saving silver for the right person, though he never specified who that might be. Clara smiled, a knowing smile, one that suggested she understood exactly what Hope had found beneath the floorboards, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she offered her help, promising to return the next day with more seeds and some starts for a herb garden. She told Hope that she had been a midwife for 40 years in the valley, and that when the baby's time came, Hope was to send word to Pine Ridge Farm immediately. True to her word, Clara became a constant presence in Hope's life over the next few months. She arrived every few days with bundles of herbs, jars of preserved peaches, and advice that was just as valuable as the information in Cornelius's journals. Together, they finished the whitewashing of the house and began the task of sewing curtains from the fabric Hope had brought from the city. Clara taught Hope how to read the weather by the behavior of the birds, and how to make a healing salve from the wild calendula that grew near the spring. The garden began to flourish under their combined care, the green shoots of the beans climbing the trellises and the squash leaves spreading across the dark earth. For the first time in her life, Hope felt like she was part of a community, even if that community consisted of only one wise old woman, and the memory of a man who had left his legacy in a tin box. However, the peace of the ranch was interrupted in August by the arrival of a man named Arthur Finch. Hope was in the kitchen, preparing a stew from the first of her harvest, when she heard the sound of a heavy truck coming up the drive. She walked to the door and saw a man in his 50s stepping out of a late-model pickup truck. He was dressed in expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen a day of actual work, and he carried a leather briefcase under his arm. He introduced himself as Arthur, a distant cousin of Cornelius Reed, and claimed that he was there to conduct an inventory of the family heirlooms that had been left behind. He spoke with a loud, booming voice that seemed to demand space, and he wore a smile that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. Hope felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the same feeling she had when Lawrence used to lie to her. She stood her ground on the porch, informing Arthur that she had purchased the property legally from the rightful heir, and that the deed included everything on the land. Arthur's smile faltered for a second before returning even wider than before. He argued that there were certain items of personal value that were not included in the real estate transfer, and that he had a right to search the house to ensure the family's history was preserved. He tried to brush past her, but Hope moved to block the doorway, her hands resting protectively on her belly. She told him firmly that no one was entering her home without a court order, and that if he believed he had a claim, he should take it up with the county clerk in Boise. Arthur's face turned a mottled shade of red, and his tone shifted from oily charm to open aggression. He accused Hope of being a squatter who had taken advantage of an old man's estate and threatened to involve the sheriff. Hope didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like Arthur before, men who used volume and threats to cover up the fact that they had no real power. She told him once more to leave her property, and this time she was joined by Clara, who had just come around the corner of the house with her mahogany walking stick. Clara didn't say a word, but her presence was enough to make Arthur hesitate. He climbed back into his truck, shouting that she hadn't heard the last of him, and drove away in a cloud of dust. Hope was shaking, but Clara placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, reminding her that a man who has to shout for his rights usually doesn't have any. Clara explained that Arthur Finch was well known in the neighboring towns for being a bottom feeder, someone who spent his time looking for loopholes in inheritance laws to squeeze money out of grieving families. She assured Hope that the deed was ironclad, and that Arthur was simply trying to bully her into giving up any valuables she might have found. Clara suggested that Hope keep the silver coins hidden and not mention them to anyone, as word of a treasure would only bring more people like Arthur to her door. They spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the gate and making sure the locks on the doors were secure. Hope felt a renewed sense of protectiveness for her home. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a fortress she had built for her child, and she wouldn't let anyone take it away. Arthur Finch returned 3 weeks later, this time accompanied by a younger man who looked like a law clerk. They arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning, waving a piece of paper that they claimed was an official notice of a pending lawsuit. Arthur was smug, convinced that the sight of legal documents would be enough to break Hope's resolve. He demanded to be let inside to inspect the assets of the estate, citing the paper as his authority. Hope walked to the gate, took the paper from his hand, and read it carefully. She saw immediately that it was not a court order or an injunction. It was merely a formal letter of intent written on a law firm's letterhead. It had no legal power to grant him entry into her home. She handed the paper back to him through the fence and told him that she would be happy to discuss the matter with his lawyers through her own representation, but until then, he was trespassing. Clara, who had been staying with Hope more frequently as the pregnancy reached its final month, stepped out onto the porch with a shotgun that she used for scaring off coyotes. She didn't point it at them, but the sight of the weapon resting in the crook of her arm was enough to send a clear message. The younger man looked nervous, tugging at his collar and whispering to Arthur that they should probably leave. Arthur was furious, but he realized that he couldn't bully two women who were clearly prepared to defend their land. He retreated once more, his threats echoing through the valley, but he never returned. Word had spread through the community about the brave woman at the Reed place, and the local sheriff, a friend of Clara's, made a point of driving by the ranch twice a week to check on Hope. The attempted intimidation had only served to cement Hope's place in the valley. The final month of the pregnancy was a time of quiet preparation. Hope spent her days finishing the nursery in the small back room, using the fabric she had saved to make a soft lining for the wooden cradle that a local carpenter named Percy had built for her. Percy was a man of few words, a friend of the late Cornelius, who had refused to take any of Hope's silver coins for his work, saying that Cornelius would have wanted the baby to have a proper place to sleep. The garden was now in full production, providing more food than Hope and Clara could eat. They spent their evenings canning tomatoes and drying herbs, the kitchen filled with the rich, earthy smells of the harvest. Hope felt a sense of peace she had never known, a deep-rooted stability that came from knowing exactly where her next meal was coming from and that the roof over her head was truly hers. The birth began in the early hours of a cool September morning, just as the first hint of frost was touching the tops of the mountains. Hope woke at 2 o'clock in the morning with a sharp, insistent contraction that told her the time had finally come. She lit a lamp and sent a signal to Clara by hanging a red lantern on the front porch, a prearranged sign between the two neighbors. Clara arrived 40 minutes later, her mahogany stick clicking against the gravel, carrying her midwife's kit and a calm, commanding presence that immediately put Hope at ease. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 12 hours, but Hope drew strength from the memories of her mother and the silent support of the man who had left her the journals. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with the autumn sun streaming through the kitchen window, Sophie was born. Sophie entered the world with a healthy, vigorous cry that seemed to fill every corner of the ranch. She weighed 7 pounds and had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were already wide with curiosity. Clara cleaned her, wrapped her in the soft blankets Hope had sewn, and placed her in her mother's arms. Hope looked down at her daughter and felt a love so profound it was almost frightening. She whispered Sophie's name, telling her that she was home and that she would never have to worry about a roof over her head or a meal on her table. Clara stayed for 3 days, helping Hope recover and teaching her how to care for the newborn before returning to her own farm. The ranch was no longer a place of ruin and isolation. It was a place of life and beginning. The years that followed were defined by the steady, rewarding rhythm of life on the land. Sophie grew up with the ranch as her playground, learning to walk on the uneven floors of the kitchen and taking her first steps in the rows of the garden. She was a child of the earth, her fingernails always stained with soil and her pockets full of interesting stones and dried seed pods. Hope continued to follow the journals of Cornelius Reed, expanding the garden until it became a small farm that supplied vegetables to the entire county. She used the remaining silver coins to buy a milk cow and a dozen laying hens, providing a steady income that allowed her to save for Sophie's education. She also began to keep her own journals, documenting her experiences and adding her own discoveries to the legacy of the Reed homestead. When Sophie was 10 years old, Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep at Pine Ridge Farm. She left her mahogany walking stick to Hope and her collection of medical books to Sophie, whom she had treated like a granddaughter. Hope took over the role of the local midwife, having learned everything Clara had to teach, and became a pillar of the community. She was the woman people turned to when they were sick or when a new life was coming into the world. The ranch became a gathering place for the neighbors, a symbol of what can be achieved through hard work and the courage to start over. Arthur Finch eventually lost his law license after being caught in a fraud scheme in another state, and Lawrence was never heard from again, a ghost from a past that no longer had any power over Hope. Sophie grew into a strong, independent woman who shared her mother's love for the land. She went to college to study agriculture, returning to the ranch with new ideas about sustainable farming and soil health. She married a local man, the son of the carpenter Percy, and they built a small house on the far side of the property near the apple tree. They had 3 children of their own, filling the ranch with the sound of laughter and the energy of a new generation. Hope, now in her late 60s, moved to the smaller house at the back of the property, leaving the main house to Sophie and her family. She spent her days in the garden tending to the herbs and the flowers, a contented woman who had fulfilled the promise she made to a man she never met. One afternoon, in the middle of a golden October, Hope was sitting on the porch with her eldest granddaughter, a bright 7-year-old named little Clara. The young girl was full of questions about the history of the ranch, wanting to know how her grandmother had come to live in such a beautiful place. Hope decided it was time to share the secret she had kept for nearly 40 years. She led little Clara into the kitchen and pointed to the floorboard near the stove, the one that still made a slightly different sound than the others. She told the girl about the day she found the tin box and the silver coins that had saved her life and allowed her to build the world they now lived in. She retrieved the rusted tin box from the back room, where it had been kept in the cedar chest alongside the journals. She opened it and showed the girl the letter from Cornelius Reed, the faded blue ink still legible after all these years. Hope read the letter aloud, her voice steady and filled with emotion, as little Clara listened with wide-eyed wonder. When she reached the part where Cornelius asked the next inhabitant to care for the earth, the young girl reached out and touched the weathered paper. Hope explained that the silver coins were long gone, spent on the roof, the seeds, and the education of her mother, but that their value remained in every tree, every plant, and every beam of the house. Hope told her granddaughter that the real treasure wasn't the silver, but the love and care that had been poured into the land by those who came before them. She explained that starting over is never truly starting alone because we carry the wisdom and the gifts of our ancestors and the kindness of strangers with us. She handed the tin box to little Clara, telling her that it would be hers one day, to be filled with her own journals and her own stories for the next generation. The girl hugged the box to her chest, promising to care for the ranch, just as her grandmother and Cornelius had done. As the sun set over the Idaho mountains, Hope felt a profound sense of completion, knowing that the cycle of stewardship would continue long after she was gone. Life is a garden that requires more than just seeds and water. It requires the soul of the gardener and the patience to wait through the winter for the spring to arrive. For those of us who have lived many seasons, we understand that the greatest gifts are often hidden in the places we least expect to find them, beneath the broken floorboards of our own struggles or within the silence of our loneliest hours. Dignity is not something that is given to us by others. It is a quality we cultivate within ourselves through our actions and our refusal to be defined by our losses. We must remember that we are never truly the first to walk any path, for the earth beneath our feet is saturated with the stories of those who struggled and succeeded before we were even born. The true measure of a life well lived is not found in the accumulation of wealth that can be counted in silver or gold, but in the legacy of care we leave behind for those who will follow in our footsteps. When we take care of something, a piece of land, a family, or a community, we are weaving ourselves into a tapestry that stretches across time, connecting us to the past and the future in a way that death cannot sever. It is important to realize that the permissions we seek from the world are often unnecessary, for the only permission that truly matters is the one we give ourselves to be happy, to be strong, and to be whole. As we age, we learn that the hardships we faced were not obstacles to our happiness, but the very soil in which our strength was grown, providing us with the resilience to withstand any storm. Let us teach the younger generation that starting over is not a sign of failure, but an act of supreme courage, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find light even in the deepest darkness. We should encourage them to look for the tin boxes in their own lives, the hidden resources of character, the wisdom of their elders, and the opportunities that disguise themselves as ruins. If we can leave behind a world where people understand the value of a single dime saved and a single hand offered in help, then we have done our job well. May you always find the strength to sweep out the cobwebs of your past, the wisdom to read the journals of those who came before you, and the grace to know that your story is part of a much larger, more beautiful narrative that is still being written by the hands of those you love.